The glass didn't just shatter. It hummed as it disintegrated into 1,000 crystalline needles, each one catching the artificial violet light of the zenith spire. Silas Vance didn't flinch as a sliver grazed his cheek, drawing a thin line of red that looked startlingly bright against his weathered, graying skin. He simply kept his hand out, palm flat on the table, while Exarch Valerius loomed over him, a creature of iridescent scales and 4 eyes that burned with the cold light of a dying star. The heir to the Luminara sovereign was laughing, a sound like grinding stones, while the rest of the trade summit held its collective breath. Valerius stepped closer, his heavy, clawed boots clicking against the polished obsidian floor, and sneered at the small, scarred man who looked more like a tired gardener than a representative of Earth. It turned out that arrogance was a universal constant, even among species that had mastered FTL travel before humans had discovered gunpowder. The sovereign looked down on the infant species not with hatred, but with a bored, clinical dismissal. To them, humanity was a frantic, short-lived blink in the cosmic eye. Valerius had spent the morning poking at Silas, mocking the utilitarian fabric of his uniform and the way his hand shook slightly when he reached for his water. The Exarch saw a broken blade, something discarded and blunt, failing to realize that a broken blade cuts deeper than a whole one. The tension had started hours earlier in the Great Hall, a place of soaring arches and gravity-defying fountains. Silas had been quiet, absorbing the insults with a terrifyingly still expression. He was there to talk about mining rights in the belt, but Valerius wanted to talk about superiority. The Exarch had intentionally tripped to junior human attaché, and when Silas stepped in to steady the boy, the alien had slapped the glass from the veteran's hand. Truth is, Silas wasn't looking at the Exarch. He was looking past him, at the swirling nebulae visible through the spire's transparent hull. He looked like a man inhabiting the silence of a sleeping storm. Every time Valerius barked a fresh indignity, Silas just adjusted his posture, his boots making a dull, heavy sound on the floor. There was a weight to him that the Luminara couldn't quite calculate, a density of spirit that didn't show up on their biological scans. As Valerius leaned in, his breath smelling of ozone and sweet ammonia, he whispered a final slur against the colony worlds Earth had lost decades ago. Silas finally moved. It wasn't a strike. He simply stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and possessed a sudden, gravity-shifting authority that made the guards at the door shift their pikes. In that moment, the Sovereign's chief archivist, a spindly creature draped in sensory veils, let out a sharp, panicked trill from the back of the room. The archivist wasn't looking at the trade documents. He was staring at a flickering holographic display of human history that had finally finished decrypted. The images flashing across the archivist's screen weren't of diplomats or farmers. They were grainy, terrifying thermal feeds from the Krell hegemony's final stand. They showed a single human figure moving through a burning throne world like a vengeful ghost, dismantling an empire with cold, surgical precision. The name attached to the file wasn't Envoy Vance. It was the Godslayer. Silas wiped the blood from his cheek with the back of his thumb. He looked at Valerius, and for the first time, the Exarch saw the eyes of a man who had nothing left to lose but his peace. The silence in the summit chamber shifted from uncomfortable to suffocating. It wasn't just the lack of noise, it was the sudden, collective realization of a predator in the room. The archivist's hands trembled as he manipulated the holographic display, casting the ghost of a dead empire across the faces of the Sovereign. They saw the Krell throne world a fortress of shifting metal and ancient malice folding in on itself. They saw the God-Slayer walking through a corridor of fire, his movements stripped of wasted motion, a terrifying machine of pure intent. Valerius stepped back. The iridescent scales on his neck flared, a physiological response to a fear his mind hadn't yet fully processed. He looked from the terrifying projection to the man standing before him. Silas Vance hadn't drawn a weapon. He hadn't raised his voice, but the air around him seemed to thicken, pressing against the lungs of everyone present. Truth is, the Sovereign had mistaken restraint for weakness. They saw a man who had put down his sword and assumed he had forgotten how to hold it. But as Silas looked at the exarch, his gaze was that of a man who knew exactly how many seconds it would take to dismantle the room. He didn't want to. That was the point. He had spent 10 years trying to bury the God-slayer under the quiet rhythms of bureaucracy and soil, praying he would never have to see that version of himself again. The archivist's voice broke the stillness, a thin, wavering sound. He spoke of the Krell hegemony, a force that had enslaved 3 sectors, extinguished in a single lunar cycle by a species they had underestimated. He spoke of the man who had walked into the heart of their sun crusher and turned it off while the Krell royalty watched in paralyzed horror. Belarius looked at the floor, his bravado evaporating like mist under a harsh sun. The weight of his own insignificance seemed to crush his shoulders. He realized he wasn't standing before a diplomat. He was standing before the safety lock on a species capable of total extinction. If he pushed Silas Vance, he wasn't just starting a fight. He was ending a civilization. The exarch sank to one knee, a gesture of submission that sent a shockwave through the Luminara guards. His voice was a rasping shadow of its former self. He offered a desperate apology, his words stumbling over each other, pleading for a peace he had nearly thrown away for the sake of a petty insult. Silas watched him for a long moment. He didn't gloat. He didn't demand reparations. He simply reached out and picked up the shattered remains of his glass. The movement, steady and calm. He felt the phantom ache in his scarred shoulder, the memory of the fire, and the heavy price of the peace he was now protecting. Beware the man who has nothing left to lose but his peace. Silas turned toward the viewport, his reflection ghostly against the backdrop of the stars. He had saved his world once by destroying another. Now he would save it again by choosing to be a man who just wanted to go home. The trade summit resumed, but the tone had changed. The sovereign no longer spoke to an infant. They spoke to a sleeping giant. Silas Vance sat back down, his shaking hands finally still, the God-slayer tucked away behind the eyes of a tired gardener.